Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Now, have you had a good dinner? Yes, good. Have you had enough wine? No.
Keep drinking.
Well, I'm sure that can be organised. So indulge and be happy. Well, it's my very great pleasure not only to welcome you to the dinner, but to welcome you to this world-famous debate. There's only been one before, but already it is the most famous debate in the teaching and learning community globally. I can assure you of that. Rah, rah, excellent. And this one's going to be even more famous because we've got such a fantastic lineup of speakers tonight, and I will introduce you to them shortly. Just to say very briefly, we will be engaging in a parliamentary style format. I'm not sure whether that makes me optimistic or not, actually, because the performances we've seen lately there, not quite so good, but I'm sure these people will outstrip that. Just to remind you, the motion for this evening is this House believes that for the future of higher education to be truly global, education must be free for all. So I'll leave you to reflect on what you think about that now, and then to consider whether your view has been changed, whether you're persuaded by the eloquent and articulate people sitting next to me. So I'm really putting them under pressure now. I mean, Christine was already bottling it over dinner. Especially when...
They've locked the doors.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when she was told she had to make it funny and put in a few jokes. I do think that was a little bit unfair just over the pudding, Christine. However...
You should have had the one that Alison told me.
Yeah, please don't go there. Please don't go there. Yes, I've told the squirrel joke already, but not for now. So, just to remind you of the format, there are two teams of two speakers arguing for and against the motion. Each person will have 10 minutes to state their argument, and we will alternate between the teams of all four until all four people have spoken. Be prepared. You cannot fall asleep. You have to listen because there are going to be 20 minutes of questions, and we will be noticing who asks the questions because we'll know you haven't been asleep. Or if you have been asleep, ask a question anyway. It'll be fine. Okay. So this is quite a serious debate, by the way. I'm just trying to calm the nerves of my colleagues here, but we should make it fun as well. So we're going to take questions from you for about 20 minutes. After then, this is to give our colleagues also a bit of a breather. We will return to each speaker, and they will speak then in reverse order, and they will give us their summative arguments. I would rather suspect that Shmita, with all of her training, should be rather good at doing this as a lawyer, but she's looking a bit worried at that. When was the last time you did that, Shmita?
Oh, God, about 10 years ago.
Oh, well, fair enough. It's okay, guys. You're all on an even playing field here. That's fine. Okay, and we're then going to ask you to vote, okay? So you've all got cards on your table. I asked what the voting was and how we were going to do it, and then somebody very helpfully pointed out that it says, I vote in favour on the top, or I vote against on the bottom. So just make sure you hold it up the right way when we get to that stage. So, in case you haven't noticed, I am the debate host, but I'm also the timekeeper. So I don't quite know how I'm going to manage that, but I'll make sure that you do realise if you're overrunning, okay, any of you. I'll let you know in some way or another. Perhaps I could just say, actually, rather more kindly, a few words about our fabulous speakers. And I think we should really, really appreciate them for standing here and doing this tonight. I think it's a difficult motion to debate. So ahead of that, let's give them all a round of applause. So, starting from my right here, Professor Christine Jarvis. And if you were here yesterday, you would have been fortunate enough to hear her fabulous keynote speech. Christine is the PVC Teaching and Learning at the University of Huddersfield. She began her career working with unemployed young people and then went on to teach in further and adult education. Her research interests are interdisciplinary, combining literary studies, cultural studies, and education. Christine believes that all learners, regardless of background or ability, deserve the best educational experience. That's Christine. On my immediate left is Shmita Jamdar. I'm sure she's well known to many of you, and she is the relationship partner for Shakespeare Martineau's education clients and advises on strategic, regulatory, constitutional, governance, and student matters. Shmita is a member of the Higher Education Commission, a regular speaker at sector conferences, and an enthusiastic contributor to sector debate through the firm's educational blog. Going Further and Higher and her Twitter feed at Shmita Jamdar. I'm sure you haven't seen her on Twitter, have you? I mean, to my immediate right is Shaira Sheff. Now, Shai is the president of the University of the People, UO People, the world's first tuition-free, non-profit, accredited online academic institution dedicated to opening access to higher education. Grounded in the belief that knowledge is a key ingredient of world peace, UO People provides access to collegiate-level studies to qualified individuals regardless of geographic, financial, or societal constraints. Now, you're opposing this, aren't you? No. No, I think you're on the right side there, and you are supporting something you believe in, so that sounds jolly good. Thank you. Last but not least, someone who will also be well known, I'm sure, to all of you, is Nick Hillman, who has been director of HEPI since 2014. He worked for the Right Honourable David Willetts, MP, now Lord Willetts, the Minister of Universities for Science from 2007 until the end of 2013, as Chief of Staff and then Special Advisor in the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. Previously was a history teacher. I didn't know that, Nick. History teacher, and worked at the Association of British Insurers. At the 2010 general election, he was the runner-up in Cambridge. So, thank you very much, speakers. We know who you all are now, and we look forward to what you have to say to us. So, the debate starts. And in slot 1, it's my pleasure to ask Christine Jarvis to speak for the proposal.
Thank you.
And you have 10 minutes.
Thank you. I bet you'd rather it was karaoke, wouldn't you? Sing you a song. Colleagues, my support for the motion rests on the argument that the world and this country need a highly educated population in order to survive, let alone succeed. The benefits to society from higher education exceed the benefits received by individuals, and society simply cannot afford to have HE skewed by market forces which turn it into a commodity that is sold purely as an individual benefit. And above all, my support rests on the argument that we are one society. So I am going to make 3 points. First, each one of us benefits as an individual from higher education and from the skills of the graduates that higher education produces. Second, we benefit not only personally and individually, but collectively as a society and a community. We are simply a better society because we have an educated population. And thirdly, that by presenting education as a commodity, a product for sale, we seriously skew the choices people make about their higher education. And this damages the whole of the nation by limiting what we learn and how we think. So, first, the benefits to every individual. Of course, I know that those who go to HE benefit personally. There's evidence of the benefit that we accrue in terms of health and well-being, happiness and economic success. But the impact on personal economic success is given too much weight in current policy because it leads to the conclusion that individuals should pay for the whole of their higher education. If, for example, the average lifetime premium on earnings is about £150,000 and calculations vary, and we expect people to work for about 45 years, that's about $3,300 per year somebody gets. But that's only an average. But of course, if people benefit by getting higher wages from going to HE, they do pay for it. They will pay for it anyway because they will pay more tax. And we have a progressive taxation system in this country. I believe it is simply unjust to ask people to pay for it again through what amounts to an additional tax alone at RPI plus 3%. We are asking people to pay twice for their higher education. And we're sometimes asked why those who don't go to HE should subsidise the education of those who do. And this masquerades rather disingenuously, I think, as a defence for the poor and disadvantaged who don't participate. Well, I think that objecting to paying for higher education because you aren't going yourself is as short-sighted as objecting to paying for schools because you haven't got any children. The skills, knowledge and expertise that's generated in our HE institutions benefits every single member of society because non-graduates need nurses and doctors. Their children go to school where graduate teachers teach them. They wear clothes designed by textile graduates. They drive cars, they use buses, they sit on trains designed by engineers, and they live in houses made safe by building surveyors. They use technologies developed by electronic and software engineers. They communicate with the age of communication technology graduates, and their lives have been saved by scientific and medical research, and so on. Whether we like it or not, we are all in this together. We all depend on each other. So why should the researcher, why should the scientist carry the whole burden of their training costs? And the people who benefit from their research and expertise pay nothing. And even if you are one of those proud, wealthy, self-made, globally successful entrepreneurs who tell us proudly that they never went to higher education, how many graduates do you depend on to make, design, sell, market, and develop your products? Second, we benefit as a whole society. There's huge evidence of benefit to society as a whole population because graduates bring qualities to the world that it desperately needs. Don't take my word for it. The government's own research identified this in a report produced in 2013, published by what was then the Department for Business, Industry and Skills. That report tells us that graduates are more likely than non-graduates to be tolerant. In a world which is riven by prejudice and intolerance, tolerance, inclusivity, and cultural understanding are more important than they have ever been. And the intellectual breadth and depth provided in degree-level education helps to lift people's perspectives, and it helps them to understand different worldviews. And graduates quite simply commit fewer crimes than non-graduates. You didn't know how good you were, did you? Not only is this critical for saving us the misery caused by crime, it means they cost society less in terms of policing and the justice system. And we are less likely to drink excessively. And believe it or not, after this meal, it's true, we are less obese. So we cost the National Health Service less in terms of the health and social problems created by alcoholism and obesity. And graduates are more likely to vote and participate in politics. Do you not think that apathy and political disengagement are a blight on society? We simply cannot leave the running of this country to a small, highly educated, usually privately educated elite, shrug our shoulders and say nothing can be done. Graduates will take up the cudgels for the causes they believe in, however inconvenient that might be to some people who disagree with them. And graduates are more likely to be engaged in voluntary and charitable work than non-graduates. And they offer better educational parenting. And they are more productive in the workplace and more likely to be entrepreneurial in their approach to their work. So we have to encourage as many people as possible to continue in education. And I mean education, not just training and upskilling throughout their lives. And finally, what people study and who studies what is distorted profoundly by selling HE as an individual benefit. It's distorted to the detriment of us all and to the detriment, I believe, of social justice. What happens if we focus only on education as a benefit to individuals, something for which they should bear the entire cost? What happens is that education becomes something many people feel they can only afford and only justify if they're absolutely confident it's going to lead to a job, if it produces concrete economic returns they can guarantee in advance. There's a mistaken assumption, of course, that only courses that are narrowly vocational produce employable graduates. But it makes people afraid to choose more general academic subjects, making HE entirely about individual benefit, and individual economic benefit at that, reduces our curriculum offer. It cuts down on the people who choose the arts, the humanities and the social sciences, and even general science, in favour of vocational training. But that, of course, limits the wider benefits to our society that accrue from studying the liberal arts and the social sciences, from the opportunities that literature and the arts afford to see the world through the eyes of others, to develop empathy and awareness of different cultures and perspectives, to study philosophy, social science, and have the ability to critique the world in which we live. Moreover, that need that's created to have a predetermined vocational outcome, that need which is created by the knowledge of that huge overhanging debt, means that it's the most vulnerable and the poorest in our society who feel driven to select only training courses. Like many of my colleagues, and I suspect many of you here today, I was first in my family to go to university. My parents had no money, etc., 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 and we all managed to get by. And I went to study English literature because I loved it. And I still love it, and I loved studying it, and I loved engaging with all those ideas and perspectives. And looking at those different modes of expression was utterly life and mind changing. And I might have been able to go to university if I'd had to build up a large debt to do so. But I would have been driven to choose something more vocational, something like business studies or nursing or all kinds of other subjects which are very worthy and interesting in themselves if it's what you want to do. But I wouldn't have been able to do what I want to do, and I certainly wouldn't have been able to go on and do a master's in Renaissance literature. Sheer family terror of debt would have stopped that. This restriction of choice creates a divide between the rich and the poor, because the poor cannot afford to study academic subjects. And it means as a consequence that it's only going to be the wealthier amongst us who will have the critical skills, etc., that you develop by looking at some of these subjects, the skills that you need for leadership. I think it will drive us into a position where the working classes, the less wealthy, will be prepared as technicians to serve an elite that's prepared for leadership. Of course we need skilled workers, but to quote Richard Johnson, as well as useful education, we need really useful education. We need education with social purpose so that everyone, regardless of background, can lead, debate, and take their place as a citizen. And finally, I would say to you that higher education is a public good, not just a private benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, and you were spot on timing. That was excellent. So I'd like to invite Shmita now to come up and spend her 10 minutes speaking against the motion.
Okay, so one of the issues I have with Christine's utterly excellent presentation is that I don't believe you answered the question. Because the question is not, is higher education an utterly fantastic thing? It's, should it be free for all? So I had a number of problems with that motion, the main one being that it immediately reached for a solution, free education, without first identifying the problem it's trying to address. And I think this is something that we see permeating HE policy, certainly in the UK, especially if you think about the HE funding review. It's all about how do we fund the rather haphazard and ad hoc system of higher education that's evolved, rather than asking what I think is a more basic question, which is what kind of higher education system do we want, and from that, building the right way of funding it. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is ask that question. If the future of higher education is to be truly global, what kind of higher education do we think we need? So firstly, I think it has to be accessible to all those who need it or can benefit from it. So I'm going to talk about accessibility very much from the British context, but every country in the world has its issues around access to higher education. So it has to be accessible not just to full-time 18 to 21-year-olds, but also to mature learners, to part-time learners, to lifelong learners, to disadvantaged learners, and to learners with disabilities. It needs to be accessible to those who want to learn in a very traditional context, to those who want to learn in a work-based context, and to those who want to learn online. It needs to be accessible to those who are driven by a broad curiosity and a passion for inquiry, as well as those who see it through the very, very narrow lens of what do I need for my career. It needs to be accessible to the employee whose employer wants to upskill her so she can be more productive and he can make more money. It needs to be accessible to the trust fund baby, where privilege drips from every slurp of his gold-plated bottle, and to the child in care. And if we believe in a global future, higher education needs to be accessible to those categories of learners both nationally and globally. Now, I stress that point because any funding solution needs to reflect the wide diversity of people who will need to access higher education. Secondly, higher education has to be sustainable. Now, sustainable doesn't just mean financially sustainable, although of course it does mean that. Any system needs to be sufficiently well-resourced so that it can endure. But sustainable also means ensuring the capacity of our higher education system to thrive and to do well the things it was set up to do and to make the positive difference to the world that it is capable of doing. It means ensuring that institutions are free to chart their own futures and to set their own direction, informed by the multitude of beneficiaries that they serve. That means institutions have to be autonomous and free, but remaining accountable to their beneficiaries. And so any funding system needs to ensure that control of those things is not wrested from the institutions just by whoever pays for it. Thirdly, higher education needs to be relevant. It needs to be able to meet the needs of communities, businesses, regions, and nations today and in the future. So it means it has to have the headroom and the resource to research, to connect that research to the world around it, and to share that research in its teaching and its learning. It needs to be able to ensure that its civic footprint is a broad and positive one, and that even those who do not work or study in a university feel the benefit of its presence. It needs to be able to take a long view and find solutions for the challenges humankind faces. It needs, through independent, evidence-based scholarship and research, to hold governments to account and to uphold our fading but still vital democratic values and processes. It needs to convene and collaborate and bring together others who might have a part to play in creating those solutions. And it needs to be able to do all that across borders and across boundaries. So if that's what the global system of higher education for the future looks like, I ask you this: how could it ever be free? Actually, I'd ask you that even if you don't agree with the vision of higher education I've just articulated, because no education, whether primary, secondary, or higher, is free. Someone has to pay for it. We want well-paid teachers and researchers. We want good facilities. And we want our education institutions to go beyond teaching and research into wider civic engagement and renewal. Someone has to pay for that. So free cannot mean and doesn't mean free. The solution can't therefore be that education must be free. What it must be is that education has to be fairly funded. And fair funding must mean distributed funding sources. So the Higher Education Policy Institute Academic Experience Survey for students shows that a lot of the disquiet we see in the UK about tuition fees is not because students think they shouldn't be paying any fees at all. It's because they think that they pay too much fees. The amount is unfair. So a fair system of funding would redistribute the balance between students and taxpayers. I don't think we can stop there, and this is where I have to disagree with Christine, because the taxpayer is represented in this relationship by the government. And the government, we know, has all sorts of imperatives to act in short-term and silly ways. We need only look at the ridiculousness of some of the policies in the UK, such as cuts to the adult education budget or loans for part-time learners, that have had the effect of virtually wiping out lifelong learning at the very moment our economy needs workers to develop skills throughout their lives. So to avoid even more of this, we need to see funding from other sources. So for example, genuinely philanthropic donations. Now I'm currently sitting on a thing called the Civic University Commission, and at our last evidence session we heard how endowments built up by US universities means that they start every single financial year with hundreds of millions of pounds from their investments to spend on furthering their charitable objects before they even have to recruit a single student or win a single research grant. Imagine what that could do. Redistribution also, I think, in my view, involves being less prudish about asking those who can afford to pay more, so that these other funding sources, be they public or philanthropic, can be put to use for those who need it most. So why shouldn't businesses pay more for the graduates who, as Christine articulated, will end up making the shareholders and owners of those businesses more money? Right now in the UK, we have a socialist system for developing a key business asset, its people, and the privatisation of profit. And why shouldn't people who can afford to pay school fees of up to £40,000 a year pay a bit more than £9,000 a year for a university education, so that kids from disadvantaged backgrounds get it for free? Why should the Saudi sheikh, who can afford to pay £1,800 a week on high-end, purpose-built luxury accommodation while doing a degree in London, pay the same international fees as a poor student from Bangladesh whose education could transform the fortunes not just of his family, but his entire village? Why are we wary of asking those questions? So finally, fair funding also means universities choosing to spend the money in the way best delivers the HE system that we want to see, and finding ways to free up funds for those things that these other funding sources can't deliver. Maybe expensive, reasonable adjustments for the potentially brilliant physicist with severe disabilities, or better remuneration and secure conditions of employment for their staff. So I therefore ask you to reject this motion even, as the nonsense it is. Education is not and never has been free. And without a fair and distributed funding settlement based on a vision of the kind of higher education we want to see, not only will the future of higher education not be global, it will be diminished and bleak indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Shmita, for a very strong set of counter-arguments there. Thank you. So it's my pleasure now to, oh my gosh, Shai's clearly been stirred up by those two arguments. He's up at the lectern already. So Shai, over to you. Make the case for.
So a few years ago, I gave a talk in Higher Education Summit, and I was talking about about higher education as a basic right for all. And someone stood up and said, I don't believe that everyone deserves the right for higher education. Only a few deserve. And I said, I never thought about it this way, but let's take it a step further. Why would everyone deserve the right for food? It's the same argument. Not everyone deserves the right for food. So I do believe that higher education is a basic right and everyone should get it. And in order for everyone to get it, it should be free. We heard great reasons why. I'm not going into the reasons because I believe that most people in the world would believe and would support higher education to be free if it can be done. So I'm going into the argument how it can be done. And 9 years ago, I started an online tuition-free, non-profit tuition-free, accredited online university to offer higher education, tuition-free, for every single person on earth who doesn't have other opportunities. Now, when we launched it, the first reaction was, it's impossible. No tuition-free university can exist, especially if it's based on volunteers, if it doesn't get support of the government. It will never be accredited, it will never be sustainable, it will never succeed. Well, 9 years later, we're still here. We have 15,000 students coming from 200 countries. We are tuition-free, and we are accredited and get support of actually quite a few people around the world who were skeptical at the beginning. So how can it be done? We need to think differently about higher education. If we think of higher education as a place where students come to get knowledge, we actually come and think what would make them be a great student, what would make them get the knowledge that we want them to get. So we are not obviously trying to replace the traditional universities that obviously most of them are coming from, and we are not trying to find a place where students will go instead of other places, but we're trying to build a place where people who do not have other opportunities can get a great education tuition-free. We use technology for that. First of all, we only use open source technology. Think about it. Think how much money your universities pay on technology. We pay nothing. Then, we only use open educational resources. We don't use any IP on any material that we let our students use. We never send them to buy any textbooks. We save a lot of money. But then, we use the technology in every single way that we can. We have 15,000 students. We have 2 people in our admission office. Everything is being done automatically. We have the technology help the students sign up for courses, pay their fees, and I'll talk about the fees, get their grades, get their transcript, everything. So the technology can take us a long way. We lean on volunteers. The university has 7,000 volunteers. We only use 500 of them. And the reason for that is that we don't need that many volunteers. Actually, if you build a university that is very, very well functioned, you don't need a lot of people. So we have people who write our courses one time. Every course is being written one time, but by a great professor from a great university. Then we have instructors who deliver the courses. These people, in our case, are volunteers. They're coming from your institutions and others, getting paid elsewhere, and teaching for us for a token. Well, they help us make this institution sustainable. We ask our students to pay $100 per each end-of-course assessment fee. So a full BA, you know, the American system, 40 courses is $4,000. A full BA over as long as it takes them, by the way, we let them up to 10 years to complete a degree. This amount, the $100 per course, per student, make our operation sustainable. We have a university with 15,000 students on a budget of $5 million, US dollars, and we are sustainable. Now, part of it is obviously because the instructors are getting tokens, as I said. But think about that. We just changed their salaries to pay them as much as online instructors get in other universities, and we ran it on the Excel sheet. And it turned out that when we have 50,000 students, 50 students, we can pay all of our instructors a full market value and we still be sustainable. So this is a different model. Now, it's a model that not every university can adopt. I'm sure that you cannot. You cannot first, because probably you don't want, but also because it's really hard. Think about your institution, think about your budget, and just think how you can make it 1% of what you spend right now. It's impossible because you have a different model. But I'm saying that you can build next to your university a new model of university where education can be free for everyone. And if it's not free, it's a very low cost, a cost that anyone can afford. By the way, in our case, those who cannot afford the $100 get scholarship, but it's $100. It's not a lot. So all I'm saying is that there is an alternative that can actually change the higher education system, open the gates to those who do not have access right now, and give them the opportunity to be productive citizens, to give them the opportunity to move up the ladder. It's not instead of those who go to the best universities. Those people should continue going there. And the offering that are now exist, maybe will change a little bit, but should still be there. But what we all should think about is how do we open the gates to all the rest? The people who do not have the opportunity, and if given the opportunity, can change their life, their family life, their community, and probably our entire world. That's, I think, what we should do here and in every country in the world. And I believe that we'll have a better world in this way, a world that will be better for them, but also better for us. That's it. Less than 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shai. So we've had the why and now we've had the how in the for debate. Come on, Nick, your turn now to argue against.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to be here. For those of you who don't know, I'm director of an organisation called HEPI, and we're the UK's only specialist independent think tank looking solely at higher education, and we do a lot of work with Advance HE, including on the Student Academic Experience Survey that's already been mentioned. Like my colleague on the opposition, I actually agree with a lot of the things we've heard from the proposition. I think Christine gave a fantastic account of why higher education is so wonderful. The only thing I didn't really agree with is that graduates commit less crime. I think they're just better at not being caught after committing the crime. But beyond that, I agreed with a lot of what she said. I also agreed with, well, I learned a lot actually from Shai, because I didn't know anything actually about his organisation before. I found it very illuminating and enlightening and interesting. But of course, the longer the Shai spoke, the further he seemed to be moving away from the motion, because first of all, I personally believe academics deserve to be paid for the work that they do. I don't think it's good enough to run a university with volunteers. Secondly, he slipped in that actually a full course costs thousands of US dollars, which is not free, nothing like free. And thirdly, he said, of course, it's not instead of regular universities and complementary to them. So he didn't actually seem to be an alternative world at all. It just seemed to be another extra bit of diversity and a welcome bit of diversity in the sector, but not one that ticks all the bits of the motion. So I want to make 3 points. First of all, I want to say fees deliver a better higher education than is otherwise possible. Secondly, the fees drive and deliver more widening participation than is otherwise possible. And thirdly, the fees help cement institutional autonomy, which is the basis, I believe, of the strength of the UK higher education sector. But I do want to begin by acknowledging the fees aren't popular. I don't think either of us on the opposition side are pretending fees are popular. I was flattered a couple of years ago to receive an honorary degree from Queen Mary University of London, and the degree was awarded to me, the honorary degree was awarded to me during a regular graduation ceremony. So the room was entirely full of a cohort, of a part of the first cohort of £9,000 tuition fee students. And given my background, the reason I was getting this honorary degree was that I'd worked for David Willett and helped him triple tuition fees. I've never been in a room where I was closer to being physically assaulted by hundreds of people. If they hadn't had their parents sitting next to them because it was a graduation ceremony, I literally don't think I would have got out alive. So we're not here to claim fees are popular. We're here to claim that they work, especially, of course, when they're backed, as they are in England, for example, by income contingent loans, which means you don't pay the money up front. So why do I think fees mean a better education? Well, I went to university in the early 1990s, back in the days when we couldn't do penalty shootouts. And before Labour had introduced, or I should say reintroduced, because fees existed in the UK until the mid-1970s, until 1977 to be precise, so I went before Tony Blair and Gordon Brown reintroduced tuition fees and did something that Margaret Thatcher had never dared do, of course. And why did Tony Blair do it? Well, he did it because people went to him, Russell Group and others went to him and said, unless you expand the funding base for our university system, we will no longer have a world-class system. And they were right, because the amount of funding for educating each undergraduate in the UK had halved between the mid-70s and the mid-90s. What had happened was the sector had doubled in size, but not a single penny more in real terms was being spent. So half the amount of money was available to educate each student. And as a result, the education that I received at Manchester University in the 1990s, frankly, was woeful. You know, I had a course with 700 other people, but the biggest lecture hall only had 450 seats in it. Our academics had no idea who we were, they were unable to teach us effectively, and they couldn't monitor our progress. And I'm not having a dig at them. It was just physically impossible with the numbers of students they had and the low level of resources. These days, Manchester and all other universities provide a much better student experience. And however controversial fees of 9,000, or now 9,250 may seem, it's a decent sum of money to spend on people's education, and that is where it's going. In fact, it's far more than many other countries spend. It's far more than was available in the past. I suspect it's far more than will be available in the future, and I think our education system will suffer if that is the case. And fees have meant, I think, a golden age for English universities, obviously not so much for some of the other parts of the UK. I'm not saying every penny is spent effectively. The HEPI Advanced HE Student Academic Experience Survey shows that 74% of undergraduates want to know more about where their fees are going. But we do have better teaching and learning facilities. We do have better remunerated academics. And we do have better support services than we did. And students are more demanding now that they pay their own fees too. Some people think that's a bad thing. I agree it's not wholly a good thing. Sometimes their demands may be misapplied. But why shouldn't students get some of the advantages that consumers get, including protection when they don't receive the things they were promised in the prospectuses? That didn't happen so much before tuition fees were introduced, because it goes hand in hand with the funding model we have. So the second point I want to make is that I think fees mean more social mobility, at least when they're backed by income-contingent loans. As I've said, between 2010 and 2013, I was special advisor to David Willett, and I'm proud to have worked on the tripling of tuition fees, not because, actually, of all the things I've said. I'm proudest to have worked on that policy because it allowed us to deliver another policy, which was the entire removal of student number controls. And I've argued on the back of that, by the way, that we should now set a new higher education participation target way above Tony Blair's 50%. I've argued for 70%, and I've got some classy online abuse for making that suggestion, but I do genuinely believe it. And I think the two things are linked, because the best way to ensure underrepresented groups can enter higher education, as Christine said, is to have more places. But those places have to be paid for. And the electorate doesn't seem that keen that they should be paid for out of general taxation. And without expansion, entry, as you know, is a zero-sum game in which the middle classes always do that extra thing, move into the catchment zone of the better secondary school, or buy extra tutoring, or send their kids off on one of those gap years that gets you extra UCAS points. When you ration places, you have fewer first and family students, fewer white working class male students, fewer students from care backgrounds, fewer students from struggling coastal towns, fewer students from other underrepresented groups. We don't ration any other part of our education system, certainly below the age of 18, so why should we ration it above the age of 18? And without a material level of fees, we know that rationing places is inevitable, because we did ration places until a couple of years ago, and they still do it in Scotland. And free education, this motion has global in it. It's not just bad for home students, it's bad for international students too. Until the 1980s, early 1980s, Britain used to subsidise international students to study in the UK, as well as home students. And when the Thatcher government announced they were no longer going to subsidise international students, Neil Kinnock told the House of Commons that international students would be repelled by higher fees. Every single university in the country opposed that policy. But if you look at the data now, you'll see that that is the moment when the explosion in international student numbers in the UK happened, because that was the moment when attracting international student numbers became a real benefit for our universities in the UK. And of course, without that extra source of funding from international students, our HE sector would be much poorer and much less good than it is. And of course, the motion for debate is not just about England, not just about the UK, not even just about international students coming here. It's about the whole world. You can run, no question, you can run a good higher education system with no tuition fees, no doubt about that. Scotland, I've mentioned, does it. Germany does it. We've written reports on some of those places in the world that do it. But you tend to find that where there are no fees, you tend to have less money spent per student and fewer places in the system. And let's go further afield. Let's look at Chile, because until fairly recently, Chile had the highest tuition fees anywhere in the world relative to local GDP. And then a couple of years ago, they elected a president who was committed to abolishing fees. Unfortunately, she couldn't find the money to abolish fees in full, but she did abolish fees for a certain proportion of the population, those from poorer households. And 3 things happened in the Chilean system, and all the information's on the HEPI website if you want to know more about it. First, the government gave the universities in the scheme less money to educate each student. In other words, the unit of resource to educate each student went down. Secondly, they put a cap on expansion, so universities in the scheme could not grow any faster than they had in the past. Well, they could grow less fast than actually than they had in the past. And thirdly, those institutions that could, and only some of them could, ran away from the Chilean government's funding schemes as quickly as they could to protect their own autonomy. So you ended up with a system that had less money per student, fewer places than otherwise, and universities less linked to the public interest. So I'm going to end there. I've given you a couple of anecdotes of my own time. I've tried to explain some of the trade-offs that policymakers have made, and of course, governments of every political colour, red, the mixed colour of the coalition, and now the blue government, have all ended up thinking fees are the best solution to the funding crisis. And I've looked at other places, Scotland, Germany, and Chile, to show why there is only one way, I think, a university-educated person could vote in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Well, 4 very well argued cases there, and I would say a combination of passion and pragmatism. And I hope that's got you puzzled now. I hope you're feeling slightly moved, or if you're not moved, you've got a chance to ask a question to help you move in one way or another, or to stick. It's a bit like poker, really, isn't it? You've got a twist or a stick on this one. We don't know yet because we'll wait your votes later. So now we have about 20 minutes or so from questions from the floor of anybody here at the table, apart from me. Of course, I'm completely neutral. So who's going to be the first person to ask a question?
Hi, so Nick Fair from the University of Southampton. It's a question for the whole panel.
Sure.
Because I found the arguments persuasive on both sides and very interesting and well put by all. Thank you. I just wondered what the view of the panel generally was on the existing free global higher education provision that we have in the form of MOOCs.
That's it. It's a very simple question. So who would like to go first? Shai, would you like to speak to that? We need to move these microphones around, Emma.
Well, I'm not sure that the MOOCs is a great comparison. The MOOCs, when the MOOCs was first introduced, the notion was everyone talked about the end of higher education, how they will replace higher education. Tom Friedman wrote on the New York Times that that's it, the end of higher education arrived. At the same time, I think that all the people in this room and others were looking at it and waiting to see what will happen with them and how they will fail, and they failed. And they failed mainly not because of what they delivered, but because of the promise, because people believe that they will replace higher education. They are not there to replace higher education. It's basically a great means to spread the knowledge. Most of the people who use the MOOCs use it in order to enrich themselves, to know new things. Most of the people have no reason to complete a MOOC course, so people start and they stop whenever they feel that they had enough. And as such, it's not academic offering. We at University of the People, actually, the opposite, we put 20 students in a class rather than 100,000. We give personalized attention. But people come to us in order to get a degree. The MOOCs is not for degree. I think that the MOOCs is a great free way to spread the knowledge. I hope that more people will use them. I think that the world is better with the MOOCs, but I don't see them as replacing higher education.
Thank you. Shmita.
So I'm going to have to violently agree with that because, I think they're again, they're like in the old days when you used to have adult education classes at colleges where, people would go along and learn basket weaving or something just because they felt like it. Well, that's great. I think in the vision of higher education that I articulated, I think there's a room for that and there's a place for that. But I don't think we can say that MOOCs will be the higher education system of the future. I think they will be accessible only to people who are quite self-motivated, want to learn, and so on. So I think it is about finding, recognizing they have a place, but they're not the answer to the problem that I think this motion is trying to address.
Are you in violent agreement, Nick?
I broadly agree. Of course, a lot of MOOCs were started as experiments by sort of IT departments and didn't always have enough pedagogy built into them as one might have liked. But I think, like lots of early waves of technology, they were overhyped, but they've probably left something useful behind. Actually, we probably did learn useful things, even though they haven't quite lived up to the expectations.
Thank you. Christine?
I'm afraid I can't disagree with anybody either very much. I think they're a really exciting opportunity for people to get access to all kinds of knowledge, to the expertise of all sorts of individuals. They can be, I think they're a great thing, but they're not the same thing as undertaking a sort of accredited course of study, and they're not held to account in the same kind of way as the rest of us are. So, yeah.
Thank you. What a great question. Oh, a second question.
Thank you all very much for those responses, and I actually broadly agree with your position on that too. Although, of course, Coventry University are currently attempting to challenge that view to some degree. And I think also it depends on how you pedagogically design your MOOC and how you monetize it or don't, how you build it into on-campus courses or don't. And I think there's a lot more nuanced picture, perhaps, than was being presented there. But broadly, I think I would agree with the panel. So thank you very much for your responses.
Thank you very much. And of course, you have managed to get the fors and against agreeing with each other. That's really good for the first question. Thank you very much. Do we have another question, please? Right over on the other side, and then there's it's K. Oh, it's over. Okay, next to Kay. So over here first. Thank you.
Is there somebody else? No,
No, you first. Thank you.
I'm going to quote Robbins from 1963, and we all know the quote. I don't know the quote. I'm going to have to read it. Take my glasses off. University places should be available to all who are qualified for them by ability and attainment. Now, I benefited from that personally, and it was transformative, and it was free. You got a maintenance grant if your family didn't earn very much, your fees were free, and you did get support. And I disagree with Nick that the education I got in the 70s was outstanding. I'm talking absolutely outstanding. It was high-pressure course, 32 hours a week, contact time. It was high pressure, but it was outstanding, and I benefited from that. I think currently that isn't the case. I think there's something else going on, and we have debated some of it here today in the thing. The problem is that somebody has to pay for it, I agree. Free for all, that maybe was the wrong motion to put forward in the end, because it's going to cost somebody something. But I would go along with the idea it has to be free for those who can benefit from it and society can benefit from it. And it has to be free for all of those. And that's possibly, in our minds, what we're debating.
Thank you. I think I'm going to pass it over to Nick to respond.
As that was the digger, me. Thank you. Thank you. Just to clarify, I did not say higher education in the 1970s was bad. I did not say that. What I said was the growth that happened between the mid-1970s and the mid-1990s was no-cost growth. The government put no extra funding. So by the end of that period, the higher education, by the time I went to university, not the time you went to university, was not good enough. And I think many academics would probably agree with that. If you want taxpayers to fund all the costs of higher education, can I suggest that we make higher education truly universal? Because people are willing to pay for universal services. They're willing to pay for the NHS. They're willing to pay, they were willing to pay for child benefit before it was means tested. They're willing to pay for school below the age of 18. So I'm not saying higher education should never be funded through taxpayers. What I'm saying is, back in the 1970s, when 5 or 7% of people went to higher education, it was reasonable it came out of the general exchequer. In a world where about 50% of people go to higher education, it is very hard to persuade the electorate to find the resources to fund universities properly. And I've been an election candidate. I've stood on the doorsteps and tried to make that case. And voters put the NHS and early years and other things before our sector. So if we want a well-funded sector, we have, in my opinion, to bite the bullet.
Shmita.
I just wanted to actually add to that I think we're endangering situations like this of talking to ourselves. We all think higher education is fantastic. Everybody in this room thinks it's the best thing and we should have lots more people doing it. The people out there do not agree with you. They do not agree with you. They don't agree with you in part because there has been a sort of deliberate and mischievous campaign to undermine universities. They don't agree with you because for many of them, you are just removed and distant and ivory towers. Whatever you think you are, you're far from where they are, some people. So this idea that we're going to persuade the electorate, the current electorate we have, with all the prejudices, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, that it has, that it is going to pay for 50, 60, 70% of the population to go into higher education, is just pie in the sky. They will not do it. So there's no point debating, can we go back to the 70s and have everyone have it free? Because there would have to be a limit on the numbers that was substantially less than the numbers that are going now. So,
Thank you, Shmita. Do the other two panel, are you happy to stay silent or speak?
I would just say I obviously agree with you, and I think that if we change the way that we deliver higher education, we can afford having many more students get quality higher education at a fraction of the price that they pay right now. So that's what I think we all should aim at.
I know I'm not supposed to say anything probably, but that's never stopped me. So I think the thing that I heard Nick say was that the unit of resource was half between the 1970s and the 1990s. So I think you went at a great time to be in higher education because of that unit of resource. And in terms of the motion probably not being the right motion, I think it was chosen because it's probably quite an interesting motion. And it was chosen by democratic process. And all I could say is Jeremy would be very disappointed with that statement. However, moving on, no joke at all there, clearly people don't know what I'm talking about. It was the will of the people, the motion, it was the will of the people. So there's a question over here, and then there's a question over there. So can we, and then there's one here. So there's, no, is that not a question over there now? No, okay. So we'll go to the back here.
Hi, Natasha Radcliffe-Thomas, University of Arts London. I would just like to, the question is a little bit problematic for an economist because I think free for all you mean no direct out-of-pocket expenditure, but that is not my question. I'd like to hear the panel's opinions about the definition of truly global because we haven't really heard that yet.
Who would like to respond first to truly global? Shmita.
Okay, I'll go ahead. So what I took truly global to mean was this idea that you would have a system of higher education that permitted people to sort of freely move or study in different systems. Now, they may not need to move because you could, of course, do it online and you could have connections in other ways. But I sort of, that's what I meant or understood truly global to mean. That you wouldn't necessarily have the same model everywhere, but you could have movement between different systems of higher education so that people studied globally and together across national borders.
Christine, given that you did the keynote, the opening keynote on the global graduate, and what do we need in terms of teaching that, would you like to reflect on that question, please?
Yeah, I think what I understand by truly global is an education that is not narrow, narrowly vocational or narrowly defined, but will allow graduates to have the time and the opportunity to reflect, to develop as critical citizens, to understand about the world at large, to develop critical thinking skills, to develop cultural awareness, and to generally be really well advanced international and global citizens. So that's my understanding of a truly global education.
Any comment from other panel? Oh,
just two very quick points. If you think of higher education institutions as being communities of scholars unhindered by national boundaries, well, again, it goes back to some of the points my colleague was making. That costs money. You know, what I would like to see is a funding system where you can take your funding package, your entitlement to fees and maintenance, with you to any country in the world. You know, and I tell you, that's much more likely to have transferability of students through a fees system where you can take your funding entitlement with you than through a taxpayer-funded system. I also want to say very quickly, I mean, our annual lecture this year in November will be on African higher education. I spent some time educating primary school teachers in a town in Rwanda, the only town in Rwanda that has historically had a university. And, of course, there's some very interesting work on Africa about how fees, this is predominantly about the schools in Africa rather than universities, but about how fees, low-cost schools with fees in Africa have actually delivered a very high quality education, and James Tooley, as many of you will know, is making interesting arguments around that.
Talking about globalization and truly global, I think that the way is online. That's the only place where in every class you can put students from as many countries as you want, expose them to different culture, let them interact with different cultures, see how people think, open their mind, create a shift in attitude toward people from hostile countries. That's the real way to open the mind of students. It's very easy to do, and I think that every university ought to do it independent of anything else that they give the students. It's an amazing asset to give to the students.
Thank you. We have a question right at the front here. If we could have a microphone, please. I think we need the microphone so that we can get you on the recording. Thank you.
This is for Smita and Nick, I think, but the others are welcome to join in as well. And it's more of an observation than a question. But in response to the comment you made that higher education is not free, I don't think anyone in the room believes higher education is ever free. The issue is clearly who pays for it. And it should come out of the public purse. It is a public good. And the way we know that to be the case, and Nick's made a point that if you say to the general public, do you wish to pay more for higher education? The answer is not if it means cuts elsewhere. That's a perfectly reasonable response. It's a reasonable question, a reasonable response. If you rephrase the question to the general public, do you think it would be a good idea if we increased the number of doctors in the NHS, or the number of nurses in the NHS, or the number of engineers, or the number of name the specialism you care to use? Generally, I think the response might be, do you know what, I think that is a pretty good idea, and I might be willing to pay for that. So part of their problem is we have not phrased the question in the right way about how we're going to pay for higher education. And the other issue is that the current system of higher education funding through student loans, all it's done is privatise a public debt, and it's kicked the can down the road. And this is a tidal wave that will engulf the whole of the university system fairly soon.
Questions and points. So over to you, Nick, first.
There's an enormous... Well, first of all, we should point out you're a colleague of one of the speakers on the other side, just because you didn't introduce yourself. You're the only person who asked a question. You didn't say where you were from. Secondly, there's an enormous contradiction in what you said. You started off saying higher education is a public good, and isn't it awful that nobody realises it's a public good, and if only we articulate it in different ways, people would understand it's a public good. And then you ended by saying, oh, and anyway, taxpayers are going to pick up the tab because it's all hidden in the national accounts, and actually we've privatised something that's actually a big debt that taxpayers are going to pick up anyway. So basically, yes, I mean, 45% of student loans paid out today will not be repaid. We have a shared funding model. We don't have a model in which the graduates pay all the costs themselves. We have a shared funding model. And on your point about doctors, we've done this. It's published work. If you ask students, should we have differential fees, the students who are most willing to accept higher fees are the medics. So the medics themselves are more willing to accept higher fees than other students. So I'm sorry, I don't just agree.
And I think the risk you've got if you go down the route that you've just described of saying, well, here are some very useful professions, surely you'd want more of these, is who's going to say yes to more history graduates? I'm a history graduate. Who's going to say yes to more English literature graduates? Christine. And so if we do that, you're actually reinforcing the idea that it's a very, very profession-based vocational training system that they want to fund. Now, can I also just say that I was not, sorry to say this, Nick, entirely supporting the system we currently have, because I think we've gone too far. What I'm saying is I think that there is a private and a public benefit in higher education, and the funding system needs to reflect that. And students, as far as we can see, didn't have the same objection to paying £3,500 fees, and probably wouldn't have had the same objection to paying maybe £4,500. But there's a tipping point that we have passed. And I think so to me, the idea of going back to a taxpayer-only funded system would impact on autonomy, it would impact on numbers in a way that perhaps a fair funding system, which is what I'm advocating, wouldn't do, is the hope.
So great question there and comment. You really got a mic fighting now. We're getting a bit of dissent, a bit of difference. This is what we're after. Great stuff. So Gary, over to you at the back. Could we have a microphone over there, please?
Gary Loke from Advance HE. Smita, it's actually a question for you because I've really enjoyed debate, but you did say something earlier, something to me which I found fascinating about, you talked about the Saudi education system paying perhaps for a Bangladeshi student, for example, and how you redistribute income, which I'm all for. I think the redistribution of income is great. But then you then talked about how it's pie in the sky that we can persuade people in the UK to pay for education that they don't think benefits them. So I guess I want to know how you would argue to the Saudis that they should redistribute their income to pay for someone else's education who's not Saudi.
No. So I think I may not have been as clear as I should have been. I wasn't saying that the Saudi government would pay us to educate a Bangladeshi person. However, I don't know the Saudi government, but I suspect that's pretty unlikely. What I was saying was, at the moment, we charge, as institutions here, the same international fees to an incredibly wealthy Saudi sheikh, the son of a Saudi sheikh. There's a tongue twister if you ever want to try one. Let's not try that again. That person, as you would to somebody who is, we would say, these are the international fees, everybody pays the same. I'm saying, if we want to create some space where there's money for poorer people, we should be saying to people like that, if you can spend £1,800 a week renting some accommodation just behind King's Cross, which has got marble this and air condition that, then you can actually pay a bit more for the fees, what you're studying. So I'm not asking the Saudi government to do anything. I'm saying that Saudi sheikh needs to make the decision, is he willing to pay higher fees here? And then the university ought to use that money to say, I will not charge the Bangladeshi student as much because they can't afford it, is my argument. True sort of direct redistribution.
Thank you. So a bit of means testing. A bit of means testing here. Okay, we've got time for, these are going to be the last two questions, here and here, I think. We'll see. Okay, we'll see how the time goes, but can we take this question, and there's a question there, and that third question, and then we'll see how we get. So we're going to have 3 questions. In fact, we're going to have 4 questions, all in a row. Okay, get writing, panel, get writing, and then you can choose the one you want to answer, okay? So let's have them all together. So who's going first?
Sandra Jones from Murrumbidgee in Australia. I'd just like to ask the panel one question, all of the panels. What are the risks to the global society of not making higher education free?
Okay, thank you. Good question. This question here.
Hi, Adam Shaw, Liverpool Business School. Given that education is free at point of receipt, how does free education actually work? What is the meaning of free education, and is it not free currently?
Okay, good question. Thank you. Question here.
Hi, Rick Fothergill from University of Central Lancashire. As a supporter of 2 girls who have just been through higher education, twin daughters, and supporting them through that process. They've recently completed their course that luckily was bursaried, and they didn't incur any fees during that, and have gone on to have fairly successful careers, both in the NHS. They look at their counterparts who did similar courses and have not gained employment, and are looking to me now to say, well, Dad, what do you think we should be doing in terms of thinking about the future for what we need to do for our children? They're now 3-4 years since post-qualifying, and they say, is it fair that we should be having to pay for our kids now into the future? I'd just like what your views are on how I should potentially answer that question to them.
Okay.
That's as a dad, not as an academic.
Okay, so we got the dad question. Okay, this is a really serious question, guys. Okay, he's got to go home and get the right answer to that. We've got what's the risk of not having global free education? And, well, education is free at the point of receipt and delivery at the moment, isn't it? That's the point you're making. So what's the problem, really, I think, is kind of broadly it. Okay, panel. I think you can answer 1, 2 or 3, although the lady over here from Australia would like the panel to all answer her question. Are you still trying to make your mind up, do you think, or you just want to test them? Test them, okay, fine. So who'd like to go first? Christine's going to go first.
I think the risk in terms of not making it free is simply the growth in inequality and a growth in ignorance. Leave it there.
Okay. Shai?
I would echo what you said. I think that we won't be the same society if higher education will not be free. I would just like to emphasize that free doesn't mean zero. Between zero and the cost now, there is a huge difference. But we want to make it ultra low cost, that every single person would be able to afford it, and those who cannot afford it will get full scholarship so they can afford it. That's the meaning of real free, and it can be done, and that's what we should all aim at.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Shmita and Nick to answer the question about, well, education is free at the point of delivery at the moment, so what's it all about and how do you make it work? And then I'm going to come to you two to answer the dad question, okay? And then we will move into summing up. So over to Nick and Shmita on the second question. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I've got to just come back on Shai there, because he just said free does not mean free. I mean, that is reinterpreting the motion to the most unacceptable extent. I'm sorry, and that has to be put on the record. I mean, on the risk, because we were all asked to answer the risk question, I think the risk of free education is much greater than the risks that come with having fees, though there clearly are risks from having fees. Look at some of the price inflation of courses in America, for example, some of the silly arms races that go on in America. I think, look at the US, I would say, not your own country, Australia, or our own country here, for some of the risks. I didn't totally understand the free education question, which is why I'm trying to avoid answering it. But Smita maybe will do it in a minute. But as a father of a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, I do want to answer the father one, because I actually think the best thing your daughters can do is campaign for the maintenance of the current system. Because if they want their children and my children to have the chance to go to higher education, they need loads of places. And if they want those higher education places to be well funded, they need lots of resources. And what we don't want is a fee system where you have to pay the fees up front and it's really penal, or even where the repayment system afterwards is penal. 9% on your earnings above £25,000 a year, then written off after 25 years with in-bill life insurance, is a better deal than you're ever going to get from any bank or any credit card company. And in the old days when taxpayers funded higher education, the higher rate of tax, or even the basic rate of tax, was much higher than it is now. And so your take-home pay wouldn't have been any higher. And the free education thing, I didn't totally get the question, if I'm honest.
So I think that the risk of what you've just described, because you're quite right, nobody turns up, well, that's not true. UK, EU undergraduates do not have to turn up and write a cheque, so they don't have to pay anything. Nobody writes cheques anymore. How old do I sound? They don't have to pay anything as they kind of turn up. But what we have therefore done, and I've written an article about this for Research Fortnight, which will be out soon, is we've effectively made students think that they only have to pay for what they themselves utilise. So it's a kind of eat what you kill approach to higher education. And that runs the risk of eliminating the capacity of higher education institutions to do all sorts of other things that are incredibly important to society. So I think the current system we've got has gone too far. The taxpayer, which is carrying a big underwriting function, the value to the taxpayer is no longer figuring anywhere in debates around value to higher education. So the things that Christine pointed out, having a better educated workforce generally, all the things we think are great, they have a value. That's not reflected in the current system. So it does have to change, but I don't think it should go back to complete taxpayer funding either.
Thank you, Shmita. So we're going to finish up with Shai and Christine on the dad question. Who's going first?
Okay, well, I think Nick answered the question he wasn't given, so maybe I can answer the question that I wasn't given. On the free question, saying it is free because you don't pay it at the point at which you go to, I think any of us who are engaged in admissions, in advising parents who come to talk about higher education, in talking to our students, will know that they do not perceive it as free, because they are conscious from the moment they think about what they're doing of that huge overwhelming debt. So I think that's the difference. That's why it's not free. They might not have to put their hand in the pocket at this point in time, but to them it's very, very expensive. And on the dad question, I think I would want to say that you've left them everything in your will, and that by the time they get round to going there, that might solve the problem for them.
Shy's good, Shy's good. Well, thank you very much. That was very provocative and stimulating, and we did get the panel going and disagreeing, so it's just what we were looking for. Thank you for that. Right, we're into summing up now, and you're going to kick us off, Nick.
I won't use my... We've been told we can have 5 minutes for summing up. I'm not going to use 5 minutes. You'll be pleased to know.
I think short and punchy.
So I want to use an analogy with last night. We had a game of two halves at the beginning where we each had a go. Then we had extra time where you had lots of shots at goals. And now we've got a short, sharp penalty shootout here. And I want you to do something out of the ordinary, which again is like last night. I want you to make sure the side that is not expected to win on the back of the penalty shootout, but which deserves to do so, are the victors. It happened last night, and it's in your hands to make it happen again. Thank you very much.
Oh dear. Yeah, Shy, you're next up. We like that, short and pithy. Yeah.
I should be careful because earlier I said that tuition should be very, very minimal, $100 or so, when Nick said, aha, that's not free. Therefore, the alternative is £9,000. So I'm very careful, but lucky you can't speak after me, so that's, you can't you can't say anything. Anyway, I think that in order for higher education to continue, it should be tuition free. I'm not saying that necessarily it should be free for everyone, but definitely for those who cannot afford it. It's important for the society, it's important for us, and it's definitely important for the people who need it. We can do it, there are ways to do it, and we should embrace it, and that's our future.
Thank you. Shmita, kill that argument, go on.
Well, I'm going to do the lawyerly thing, which is to say you have to vote on the motion in front of you, not the motion that it seems some of the panel wish was in front of you, which was that higher education should be a bit cheaper, or a higher education should be delivered in different ways. I mean, that's all excellent stuff. No one is disagreeing with that. But the motion you chose, all of you, I don't know why you did it, but you did, was this House believes that for the future of higher education to be truly global, education must be free for all. Okay? Now ask yourselves, can you really, bearing in mind the truly excellent arguments you've heard this evening, justify a vote in support of a motion that says education should be free for all? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shmita. Christine, the final word is yours.
Well, yes, indeed, you can justify the motion that education should be free for all. We've heard that it's not sustainable. We've heard that if it's free, it will either have an inadequate unit of resource or it will be unable to take all who benefit. But we've heard throughout history that we can't do any of the things that we need to do for the public good. We've had the NHS for 70 years. We couldn't afford that. We were told we couldn't afford old age pensions and we couldn't afford a minimum wage. What about that? You know, we can't afford anything if we listen to those sorts of arguments. Okay? And we've also been told that it will dramatically restrict our autonomy as institutions if we are funded directly by the government. We've never had less autonomy as institutions, have we? Since we began to be funded by students. What about the TEF, anybody? What about CMA, that actually tells us we can't change our curriculum, even when there are incredibly good reasons, without having the agreement of every single student, however awkward, in our groups? It just doesn't add up. I'm sorry, folks. We can afford free education for everybody, and on principle, we should have it.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, this is the moment of truth. It is beholden to me to remind you of the motion you are voting on. This House believes that for the future of higher education to be truly global, education must be free for all. Now, before you all vote, I did invite the Electoral Commission up tonight to make sure that we actually had, a free and fair vote, and we had good code. No, I'm sorry, you can't vote. Sorry, no. And they were a bit busy at the moment, they said. So they said that Celia and Sarah are actually excellent at this. So they're going to be the official counters. And I think now is the moment to reveal your votes, please. So,
Some of you have got it the wrong way up. You just turn them round.
Oh, it's quite close. Huh? I'm expecting serious counting here. not a feel. This is not ready, steady, cook, you know. This is absolutely...
Can I just point out there's somebody holding up about 6 of them?
I know, they're disqualified. So, can you give us some sense of what are the numbers for and the numbers against? Well, I've counted 20 against, I think.
I think there were 19 for.
19 for. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, no, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. Well, I've got to 24 in favour and there were 20 against, but can I say that was an incredibly close. And who'd have thought that we would have actually got so many voting against the motion? Now, we need to... the prize, of course, for winning is the glory and all of that. But I would like to say I did have a text which said, could I let number 10 know who won tonight? Because they're looking for some people on the Brexit negotiations. So we're sending you along, OK? You got the job. Huge thanks to the panel. Thanks for yourselves for taking part. And what a good debate. Thank you very much. Thank you.